běhly tradiční 3 minutky, tak my vás vítáme na podzimním setkání KVBU, také už tradičním 13. celokomunitním. Komunita, kdo nás sledujete, tak možná víte, že oslavila před pár dny 5. narozeniny, z čehož máme velkou radost a těší nás, že se nám daří setkávat se jak naživo, tak v online prostoru. My tradičně už také na podzim zveme zajímavé inspirativní hosty ze zahraničí, nejinak je tomu i dneska. A já se jmenuji Petra Valin a společně s Gábinou Klečkou vás provedeme dnešním odpolednem.
Jo. Dobré odpoledne i ode mě, je hezké vidět mnohé tváře, i když jenom na fotografiích, ale vlastně s lidmi, kterými se normálně nepotkáváte, tak najednou se scházíme v online prostředí, tak to je hezké. Možná pro tu identifikaci si uvědomuji, že by bylo příjemné, možná bychom se zorientovali, odkud ze všech koutů k nám přicházíte, kdybyste si uvedli jméno instituce, které jste, protože nás dneska čeká i debata ve skupinkách a vlastně abychom si vás zasadili do kontextu a nějak jsme se zorientovali. Je to jedno ze 2 online setkání, máme i 2 osobní a vlastně vždycky je to příležitost potom se nějak potkat a vědět a zorientovat se v tom našem velkém prostoru vzdělávacím. Takže děkujeme za tohle.
Jak to bude dneska probíhat? Řada z vás asi viděla Padlet, ale v rámci té chvíle, kdy se ještě další přihlašují, tak to rychle projedeme. My s Gáby opět v 10 minutách shrneme, co se aktuálně děje v KVBU, ale současně i to, co už se dělo. Uděláme takový rychlý přehled. Pak nás čekají novinky z MŠMT, kterými nás dneska provede Jakub Svoboda. Bude to opravdu stručně, rychle, efektivně v rámci 10 minut. No a od 3 hodin by pak měla proběhnout prezentace, přednáška Lucy, autorky Chytrozemě. Na tu knížku jsme odkazovali i v té pozvánce, takže věříme, že někteří z vás měli možnost se do ní podívat, nebo alespoň do části. No a jak už to bývá, bude nás zajímat, které podněty si odnášíte z té její prezentace. Ty probereme pak v té poslední části od 4:30 do 5, kdy proběhne ještě krátké závěrečné slovo a Mentimeter, dotazníček, zpětné vazby.
Jak už bývá zvykem, na každém setkání si připomínáme vizi KVBU. Jak už Petra zmínila, je to dneska 5 let, ta vize vznikala v tom průběhu toho 1. roku a máte ji tam napsanou. Je to směřování ke zlepšování přípravy učitelů a zkvalitňování českého vzdělávacího systému.
Vy, co jste tu poprvé, tak vás moc prosíme, přečtěte si i klíčové hodnoty a pilíře komunity, kolem kterých stavíme vlastně nejen ten program, ale i nějakou tu kulturu, diskuzi kolem všech těch témat, které se aktuálně dějí a jsou pro nás důležitá. Tak vás poprosíme, vy, co neznáte, krátce si přečtěte.
A jenom bych možná doplnila, že je hezký, že v tomhle prostředí se děje profesní spolupráce, sdílení a učení, protože alespoň je moje zkušenost za těch 5 let, že je tady bezpečno a laskavo. A to si myslím, že je výjimečné někdy v vysokoškolském prostoru. Je na mě, viď? Teďka. Peťo, to je na mě.
My vám možná prozradíme takovou dramaturgickou. Já mám liché slajdy a Gabi má sudé slajdy, takže na sebe teď takhle gestikulujeme. Tak Gabi, teď je to na tobě, prosím.
Teď je to na mě. Tak já bych vám představila tváře, které stojí za komunitou, ale v tom dobrovolnickém, protože tady sama sedí i Hanka s Zuzkou, které jsou ty, které s vámi komunikují, ty zajišťují ten technický chod komunity a tady na tom slajdu vidíte samozřejmě Petru, mě, vidíte tam Hanku a Zuzku nahoře, což je koordinační tým. A pod nima Blanka Pravdová, Martina Tromíková, Martin Procházka, Inka Procházková, Lena Kohoutová, Jiřina Karasová a Katka Círová, děkuju. A jsou to lidé, kteří se schází, my se scházíme pravidelně a diskutujeme o tom, co v komunitě budeme dělat, co je potřeba, co se děje na poli přípravy učitelů a co bychom měli vlastně zmínit na našich setkáních a čemu se chceme věnovat. Takže tímto patří ocenění a respekt za ten čas, který dávají komunitě a vlastně tím zlepšují vzdělávání v České republice. A nově od nového roku se k nám přidají 2 kolegyně.
Veronika Bosáková z Technické univerzity v Liberci a Míša Pachelová z univerzity v Hradci Králové. Tak tímto jim také děkujeme, protože je to jejich volný čas a ta práce je dobrovolnická, takže si toho moc vážíme i kvůli tomu, že víme, že je to těžké získat někoho do realizačního týmu. Takže holky zdravíme, jestli je tady dneska máme a těšíme se na ně velice.
Možná v tomto čase, včera byl nějaký světový den dávání nebo darování a v tomto čase možná máme toho hodně a nestíháme a tak, takže když teďka nám výzvu toho, jestliže máte zájem přispět do komunity, ozvěte se nám a pošlete své jména, adresy a my se vám ozveme každý, kdo chce něco nabídnout, najdeme prostor pro to, abychom vás zaměstnali, ale to zaměstnání je velmi omezené a vážíme si. Respektujeme to, že každý máme mnoho povinností, takže i to fungování a to dobrovolnictví v komunitě je postaveno na bázi jako respektu a nějakého well-beingu. Možná pro ty, jak jsou tady poprvé nebo dlouho nebyly, tak jenom připomenutí, že jak už tady zaznělo, máme celokomunitní setkání, konají se 2 na jaře a na podzim. Na podzim máme vždycky zajímavého hosta ze zahraničí, na jaře máme nějaké téma, které se týká přípravy učitelů. Už máme trošku vyhlídku, že bychom se chtěli na jaře, když tak Peťo doplň, věnovat implementaci KRAU do studijních programů a něco v tom tématu mít. A pak nás čeká teďka v lednu, nás čeká další už 3. setkání naživo na jedno nějaké vybrané téma, za chvilku vám to představím, a v létě standardní letní škola. Měsíčně probíhají různé akce s různým nějakým zaměřením a občas vám v e-mailové schránce přistane KV bulletin, nějaká inspirace z praxe, nějaké sdělení. Ten poslední byl zaměřený na komunikaci od Jiřiny Krásové. No a někdy vznikají i pracovní skupiny setkávání, jako teďka možná pro vaši informaci během podzimu, někteří z vás do toho byli zainteresovaní, proběhly fokusní skupiny na potřeby lidí, kteří se podílí na přípravě učitelů a nějaké informace, data, které jsme získali, budou dál formovat strategii komunity a to, kam v příštím roce půjdeme v těch nadcházejících letech. Takže i tímto patří dík všem, kteří se účastnili. Nevím, myslím si, že je tady vás mnoho, kteří jste se účastnili našich fokusních skupin. Takže díky.
Tento slide na první pohled vypadá stejně jako ten předchozí, ale je tam velký rozdíl v tom, že jsou tam uvedena čísla, která ukazují, kolik těch setkání už proběhlo, kolik letních škol proběhlo a tak dále. Tak nebudeme to úplně procházet, můžete si to přečíst, ale já možná využiju toho, co říkala Gáby před chvilkou, to velké jarní setkání, které má vlastně podobný formát jako to dnešní, to znamená, že se setkáváme online odpoledne, většinou ve 3 hodinách. Chceme zaměřit právě na implementaci kompetenčního rámce a byli bychom moc rádi, kdyby ty příspěvky opravdu jako vzešly ze spod od nás. Chceme vás povzbudit v tom, že opravdu to nemusí být něco, co už je hotové, zajímá nás vlastně, jak kdo se s tím na těch pracovištích pere a jak to vypadá v tom procesu, protože jako vnímáme důležité sdílet ty věci rozdělané a je to vždycky jako výborný prostor pro to vzájemné učení. Takže kdo byste měl zájem sdílet, pak na jaře, je to ještě za dlouho, je na to prostor si to promyslet, jakým způsobem se to děje u vás na těch pracovištích, tak budeme moc rádi.
A jak už se zaznělo, co si můžete těšit o nejbližším období, teďka 23.1. v pátek v Praze bude setkání, budeme se dívat na AI přípravy učitelů. Je to nějaká diskuze k tomu, jak to ovlivní, jaký místo má AI přípravy učitelů, jak to ovlivní naši práci. A bude tam nějakých sérii různých příspěvků s tím, že opět pozveme studenty, aby i oni nám nabídli svůj pohled na přípravu a jak už tady vidíte, přihlášky přijdou zítra, takže je možno se zaregistrovat, tam nějaký omezený počet, ale relativně vysoký počet se nás tam vejde a když budu mluvit za loňskou zkušenost, kdy jsme se zaměřovali na generaci Z a problematiku generace Z a to, jak se proměňuje práce se studenty na pedagogických fakultách, tak alespoň za mě to bylo velmi přínosné. Doufáme, že i letos to nabídne nějaké nové podněty pro tu práci v kontextu širším, což je AI, se kterou všichni nějakým způsobem přicházíme do kontaktu, ať chceme nebo nechceme. No a možná malá prosba na vás. Přistávám ve vašich e-mailových schránkách dotazník komunity vzdělavatelů. Bylo to k 5. výročí, pokud jste ještě tak neučinili, jestli můžete ho vyplnit. A pomáhá nám to trošku vidět ty další kroky. Realizační tým se schází každý leden. Na jeden den máme jako strategické setkání a plánování, kde se díváme dopředu, co je potřeba a vlastně pracujeme od začátku, se pracuje v komunitě vzdělavatelů s tím, co přichází od členů lidí, kteří chodí na jednotlivé setkání. Takže vlastně je to jako už anglické slovíčko driven ze spoda, to, co komunita dělá. My v realizačním týmu vlastně potřebujeme to, aby přicházely podněty ze spodu, co je, po čem poptávka a jak můžeme pomoci nám všem v té naší práci. A to je za nás všechno.
Ano, to je přesně tak, to je za nás všechno. A my bychom teď poprosili Jakuba Svobodu z ministerstva, aby se nám přihlásil, že tu je, nebo jo, Hanka.
Ano, dobrý den,
výborně,
ahoj.
tak Jakube, moc tě vítáme, máme velkou radost, že jsi si na nás udělal čas, vnímáme to jako důležité, to propojení na ministerstvo a jsme vděční, že to funguje, takže se těšíme na tvoji prezentaci a tímto ti předávám slovo.
Já moc děkuji a já se tady teda pokusím ještě tu prezentaci taky nasdílet, ať ji vidíte. Tak. Já doufám, jestli mi potvrdíte, jestli vidíte tu prezentaci.
Ano,
perfektně, děkuji. Tak jo. A já moc děkuji za pozvání. Jsem rád, že tady můžu být. Když jsem propásl letní školu, tak jsem rád, že to může být aspoň teď. Rozhodl jsem se tady vystoupit ve vánočním svetru, nevzhledném, a to z toho důvodu, že bych chtěl všem připomenout, že se blíží konec roku a zasloužené, věřím, volno pro všechny a nějaký odpočinek, tak abychom si to připomněli, protože si myslím, že to je po tomhle roce hezké. Tak jo, měla tady se mnou vystoupit Radka Kmochová, kolegyně, nicméně z osobních důvodů se nakonec musela omluvit, tak tady vystoupím pouze já. Mnozí z vás jste tam byli a přesto to chceme shrnout. Proběhla 20.11. teďka Národní konference k přípravě učitelů a učitelek, bylo to už 3. ročník. Máte tady QR kód, těch QR kódů tam bude víc, které si můžete naskenovat. Zároveň já dám tuhle prezentaci samozřejmě k dispozici, takže když byste chtěli, tak si můžete potom zpětně ještě ty věci dohledat, proklikat. Ze zpětných vazeb vidíme, že to bylo, si myslíme, přínosné a povzbudivé. Snažíme se to tak koncipovat každý rok, aby to nebylo zaměřené jenom čistě na obsah formálně, ale aby to bylo právě jakýmsi povzbuzením ke konci roku k té práci a zároveň místem k nějakému bezpečnému networkingu, který vidíme, že se každý rok tam udává. Takže určitě se podívejte, je tam i záznam na tom prokliku, takže kdybyste chtěli zpětně se podívat, tak je to určitě možné a dohledat si, co na konferenci bylo. Já bych chtěl shrnout teďka vývoj té reformy v roce 2025, protože se událo několik změn a několik věcí, které jsou takovým završením docela dlouhodobé práce. A to první je ukotvení financování provázejících učitelů ve školském zákoně. Je to velká věc, která trvala nastavit několik let, probíhalo pokusné ověřování a teda ještě probíhá posledních pár týdnů a plynule to přechází do ostrého provozu právě od 1.1.2026. A mnozí z vás jste byli účastní i toho pokusného ověřování právě v roli vzdělavatelů nebo možná i provázejících učitelů tady. A ta pilotáž se ukázala být velmi pozitivním přínosem pro nastavení toho systému. Takže to je fakt velká věc, která se stala. Současně se novelizovala vyhláška 317 o dalším vzdělávání pedagogických pracovníků, kde se právě ukotvilo studium pro provázející učitele. Velkou věcí a velkým pozitivem je kontraktové financování, které bylo schváleno vládou. Je to program na dalších 12 let, kdy na dalším slajdu mohli jste ho vidět i na konferenci, bude na přípravu učitelů 16, nebo je to ještě více než 16 miliard korun. A je to opravdu velký balík peněz, který se podařilo do učitelské přípravy dostat a myslíme si, že to je opravdu výrazně pozitivní věc, která nás čeká a mělo by to být zacíleno a pomoct v dalších letech vám připravovat učitele velmi s takovým možná lehčím pocitem, protože víme, že to financování té přípravy v minulých letech bylo dost náročné, že jste viděli, zaznívaly ty obavy z toho, že přesně ty finanční prostředky na tu přípravu nebudou a že po vás chceme dost práce za málo peněz, tak jsme rádi, že tahle obava snad pomine. Já půjdu dál, protože čas běží. Posledním bodem, který se v roce 2025 udál, je tvorba oborově specifických kompetenčních rámců. Ta stále běží, je samozřejmě navázána i u mnohých z vás na OPJAK, takže to poběží ještě i v dalších letech. Nicméně už vlastně byly vydány oborově specifické kompetenční rámce cizích jazyků, náboženství, mateřských škol a přírodopisu a biologie. Můžete je najít na stránkách ministerstva a další OSKR se tvoří, takže proběhly tam zpětné vazby z naší strany a je tam další zapracování té zpětné vazby. OSKR je přílohou kompetenčního rámce jako takového, ale věříme, že to je dobrým nástrojem potom k propisování do dalších akreditací, které vás v následujících letech čekají, nebo už možná jste i v procesu. Tady mám jenom QR kód, takže zase, jak říkám, pošlu prezentaci, takže se můžete prokliknout. No a my jsme nechtěli, aby ta implementace KRAU byla jenom tím pokynem, který dostanete, ale chtěli jsme vytvářet nějaké podhoubí podpory, abyste měli z naší strany nějaké hmatatelné návody a způsoby, jak tu implementaci do přípravy učitelů propsat. A letos vznikla metodická doporučení ministerstva a implementace KRAU. Je to poměrně stručný materiál, nějakých 12 stran, ale je tam moc hezky popsáno i s přílohou, jak může vypadat akreditační spis a jakým způsobem nahlížíme na propisování kompetenčního rámce do akreditačních spisů. Určitě se na to můžete potom podívat. Zároveň vznikla série virtuálních lekcí průvodce implementací kompetenčního rámce. Tady je výpis těch 12, které momentálně už jsou natočené, ale ještě jsou ve střihu. Budou potom zveřejněny na edugov.cz, takže tam je později najdete. A zároveň bychom vás chtěli přizvat, pokud by vám tam nějaká lekce chyběla a měli jste nějaký nápad, o jakou lekci je možnost to ještě doplnit, co by vám třeba pomohlo, nebo si myslíte, že by mohlo pomoci někomu jinému a chtěli byste třeba přispět i vaším námětem a nějak se na tom podílet, tak jsme tomu velice otevření a můžete nás kontaktovat, ať už kolegyni Radku Kmochovou, nebo klidně i mě. Ten e-mail je jednoduchý, tam je vždycky radka.kmochová@mšmt.gov.cz a když napíšete, tak budeme moc rádi, protože tady ty materiály chceme dělat pro vás. Chceme, abyste měli podporu v té implementaci i do těch akreditačních spisů a aby se to nepropisovalo jenom formálně, ale propisovalo se to reálně do přípravy učitelů, což si myslíme, že se postupně děje už takto z začátku. Na to navazují právě workshopové dny, které někteří z vás jsou tam i lektory, takže za to taky já osobně děkuji. Je to vždycky den, proběhly v tomhle roce 4 v Olomouci, v Plzni, v Brně a v Ústí nad Labem. Celkem tam bylo 140 účastníků, což je velká účast. A zase může vám to dát nějaký bližší náhled na to, jak implementovat formativní hodnocení v praxi, v přípravě učitelů, a jak pracovat s portfoliem, tripartitis. A myslíme si, že to je zase takový možná inspirativní nástroj, který plánujeme ještě dál pořádat. Na to se váže právě první 2 workshopové dny, které proběhnou začátkem roku 2026. A to je v Praze a v Hradci Králové. Na ten pražský nemáme zatím přihlášeno tolik lidí, kolik bychom si přáli, takže tady výzva pro vás, pokud máte 15.1. prostor a chtěl byste přijet do Prahy nebo jste z Prahy, tak na Pedagogické fakultě proběhne takový workshopový den, takže se můžete přihlásit pod tím fairchem nebo případně potom do Hradce Králové v únoru. Jsou to moc fajn akce a já si myslím, že takovou přidanou hodnotou tady těchto akcí je vždycky to, že zase tam může být prostor k networkingu, k propojování fakult a další spolupráci. KVBU je přesně o tom, že propojujete se navzájem napříč pracovišti a vím jako i z těch projektů s provázejícími učiteli, že zpětně viděno je to obrovskou přidanou hodnotou tady všech těchto akcí, které pořádáme, že máte tu možnost vytrhnout se z toho pracovního procesu na tom vašem pracovišti a potkat se s ostatními někde jinde a sdílet to, co vás spojuje, a jsou témata k přípravě učitelů. No a další vývoj reformy. Tohle je výčet 3 nějakých cílů, které vlastně už se částečně dějí a budou se dít ještě více, protože programy učitelské budou akreditovány v souladu s KRAU společně s povinnými reakreditacemi, takže tam to probíhá pracoviště od pracoviště, ale je to navazující na to, co už se vlastně děje, a to je ta práce s kompetenčním rámcem a zároveň práce s provázejícími učiteli. To se taky posouvá, no a kontraktové financování, už jsem zmiňoval. Já vidím, že čas kvapí, takže už jenom shrnu přání a výzvy. To je něco, co my si přejeme a uvidíme, jestli to bude výzvou. Záleží na politické zakázce, která přijde s novým ministrem. My si myslíme, že možná ano, a že by mohl vzniknout kariérní systém pro učitele, který bude rozhodně navazovat na všechny ty změny, které přišly s reformou, a bylo by to skvělým posunutím pro prestiž učitelského řemesla a pro nějakou smysluplnost toho systému. Tak jo. Nakonec bych vám rád poděkoval za vaši práci. Není to rozhodně fráze, já si ji opravdu vážím a myslím si, že my všichni na našem oddělení jsme s vámi v úzkém kontaktu a vidíme, kolik práce za vámi je a kolik tomu obětujete ze svého srdce, nejenom ze svého volného času i pracovního. Takže moc děkuju. A to je za naše dneska všechno.
Jakube, díky. Děkujeme za aktuální informace a na další se můžete těšit na našem jarním setkání. Jak už to bývá zvykem v komunitě vzdělavatelů, vždy máme informace z ministerstva, jak je na letní škole, tak je to vždycky příjemné. Takže díky za to, co zaznělo, a já už mám tu možnost představit Lucy Crehan. Představení proběhne v češtině, nicméně poté Lucy přejde do angličtiny a zbytek bude probíhat v angličtině. V diskuzních skupinách, které budou 2krát během toho jejího povídání, tak samozřejmě je volba na vás, jaký jazyk si zvolíte. Ale možná, že to mnozí víte, možná, že to nevíte, ale Lucy Crehan je britská učitelka, výzkumnice a autorka knihy Chytrozemě, Tajemství, úspěchu, zemí s nejlepším vzděláváním na světě, ve které shrnuje poznatky své cesty po 6 chytrozemích, zemích s nejlepšími výsledky ve vzdělávání, jako jsou Finsko, Japonsko, Singapur, Kanada či Šanghaj. Po studiích psychologie a filozofie na Oxfordu a magisterském programu v Cambridge učila několik let na londýnské střední škole, než se rozhodla na vlastní oči zjistit, proč některé školské systémy fungují lépe než jiné. V těchto zemích žila mezi učiteli, učila ve třídách a sbírala zkušenosti, které přetavila do knihy, oceněné časopisem The Economist jako kniha roku. Dnes Lucy působí jako konzultantka pro vlády, mezinárodní neziskové organizace, kde pomáhá hledat inspirace ve světě a přetvářet ji do vzdělávací politiky, která skutečně funguje. A Lucy je po 3. v České republice, byla tu jednou osobně a pak jednou virtuálně, takže je to její 3. pobyt a při přípravě na tohle setkání jsme se dozvěděli, že má ráda Českou republiku a její historii. Takže Lucy, the floor is yours. Welcome again today, and we're excited to have you here and share your knowledge and experiences with our community.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone who is here for coming along today to listen to what I have to say. I'm going to be speaking to you all this afternoon about insights on teacher development from high-performing education systems. And this is based on some research that I conducted, which I think Gabriella just told you a little bit about, based on just a few keywords I was picking up there. Forgive me, I don't speak Czech. But I'll tell you just briefly a little bit about that and how I came to have an understanding of how education systems are functioning in various high-performing education systems. So I began my career as a teacher, became quite disillusioned with the education system in England. So I did not like what I saw. I didn't feel that what was happening at a policy level was helping me and my colleagues to do the best job that we could in terms of supporting those students. And I became very interested in how other countries did things, because at the time when I was teaching, our Ministry of Education and the politicians kept talking about PISA. It's like, oh, well, Singapore do this and Finland do that. And I was intrigued to see how they were achieving these high results in reading, maths and science. And in particular, how they were achieving these results for almost all children, achieving high results, but also in an equitable way, bringing along most children. So in the systems that I visited, just to give you a sense of the numbers, so you have about 1 in 10 children who are not meeting basic levels of literacy and numeracy in these countries, which is compared to in England, for example, where it's 1 in 5. So we have about 20% of our children getting to near the end of compulsory education and not having basic literacy and numeracy as defined by the OECD. So I was intrigued by what these countries were doing. So I decided to go and have a look for myself. I studied for a master's, first of all, in comparative education, and then thought I need to see this for myself and understand what it looks like in the classroom, what it feels like for teachers, what parents think, what students think. So I wrote to teachers. I didn't actually write them, it wasn't that long ago. I found their email addresses and various social media. And I just said, I'm Lucy, I'm a teacher from England. I'm interested in what you're doing in your country. Can I please come and help out? I can teach some science, I can teach English, I can hear the children read, I can do some photocopying for you, whatever I can do to be helpful. And can I stay with you too, please? And this is because I think that in order to really understand what's going on, you need to win the trust of teachers, because teachers are the ones who really know what's going on in schools and who will tell you the truth about what's happening in classrooms. And so I was very, very privileged to be able to live with teachers in Finland, Japan, Shanghai, Canada, Singapore for a month at a time, and spend that time going into schools with them. So I'm going to share my presentation now and get slightly more focused on what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, there we are. Gabriella, can you just give me a nod to confirm that you can see that? Fantastic, thank you. Now, I was supposed to be inside classrooms. That was the plan. But I was also inside hospitals. That was not the plan. So when I was in Finland, I had a rare disease called rabbit fever. And I spent a week in hospital on a drip. When I was in Singapore, my leg swelled up. And so I went to hospital with suspected deep vein thrombosis. And when I got to the hospital, I was met by seen by quite a young man, a young doctor, and he had to take blood. And he tried to take blood from me in one here, and in my arms. So 6 different places, and wasn't having any success. Now at that point, he called on a senior colleague, or I assume a senior colleague, an older gentleman who came in. The two of them had a conversation about the case, which is me, and what research suggested that they might do about this and where else they could take blood from. And in the end, they took blood from a vein in my leg. Now, the reason that I'm sharing this story is because I think, based on what I've seen in these high-performing systems, there's actually quite a lot of commonalities between the teaching profession and the medical profession. And if you think about kind of key characteristics of what it means to be a profession, one of those things is that there is a shared body of knowledge that all of the people within that profession have. It's codified. Everyone knows what it is. These are the things that you know if you are a doctor. And I'm going to give a few examples of the role of knowledge today in the teaching profession. The second way in which I think teaching is like the medical profession, and what makes a profession also, is the role of collaboration between colleagues. So I was very pleased in that context with that doctor that the junior doctor called on a senior colleague for a discussion, rather than deciding to innovate by himself and maybe trying to take blood from my neck, for example. Innovation, not helpful in that context. Instead, he called on a senior colleague who'd been around for much longer, much more experience. And so that experience is not only that the knowledge that senior doctor had didn't just come from the books, it came from years of experience as well. And I think there are parallels there in teaching too. So I'm going to talk a bit more about these parallels in the teaching profession. Just very briefly, because some people are a little skeptical about what we can learn from these countries, I want to just briefly talk about PISA, because often there are some misconceptions about what PISA measures. And people think, well, it's just measuring whether or not children can study for tests, and children will rote learn the stuff and then regurgitate it on the test, and therefore, who cares what Singapore do, because we don't want to be like that. That would be fair if that was what PISA does, but that is not what PISA does. So PISA stands for the Programme for International Student Assessment, was designed back in the 1990s by the OECD, and it measures children's performance at the end of compulsory schooling, so that's about age 15 or 16. Crucially, is testing the application of knowledge and skills in reading, maths and science in a sample of 15-year-olds every 3 years. So it's that application. Can the children use what they know to solve problems? Real life problems. I don't know if you can see my inverted commas here. They're not real life because it is a test. But they're the kind of problems that children will come across in their working lives and in their adult lives. So you can't do well in these tests if all you do is rote learn. So these countries are doing something very well. By doing well in PISA, it's not everything, of course. There's lots of other things that you want from an education system, but they are doing something that is very important well, which is teaching almost all of their students, as I said at the beginning, enough that they are able to use what they know in reading, maths and science to function in society. So here's just an example of that. This is from one of the maths field trials. I'll just give you a moment just to read that question on the left, just as an example of a piece of question from mathematics. So you can see from looking at that question that the mathematics isn't very difficult, but the challenge in this question is to know what mathematics is it that I need to use to answer this question. And this is the kind of question, you know, not about Mount Fuji in particular, but this is the kind of question that children will come across as adults in their working lives, whether or not they go into a profession that officially requires mathematics. So it's useful stuff. It's not everything, but it's useful stuff. So I was surprised on my travels, staying with teachers in these 5 different places, by how much teacher knowledge was talked about. I came from a context in England, which has actually subsequently changed a bit. But back when I was doing this research, we didn't really talk very much about teacher knowledge. We talked about teacher skill or competencies. We didn't really talk about knowledge. What is it that teachers actually need to know? And this came up quite a lot. So I had a conversation, for example, in Canada with a professor called Annie Savard, who's from Quebec. And she was doing some research on the differences between what teachers talk about in different provinces within Canada. And the reason this matters is because within Canada, education is run differently in different places, and Quebec outperforms every other province in mathematics by some way. They do demonstrably better than all the other provinces in mathematics. This is her, I'll read her conclusion because I've already put it on the slides, and then I'll tell you what the study was. But she's saying, I'm not saying, actually that's not, I'll tell you the study and then I'll read you the quote. So what she did is she got teachers from several different provinces to teach the same lesson, and she filmed them. She then showed the films of the lessons to teachers from different provinces and asked them to comment on that lesson. What she was recording was what were the teachers talking about? What are the teachers noticing when they're watching this video of someone else's teaching? And what she noticed is that in many provinces outside of Quebec, teachers would focus on general pedagogical approaches. So, you know, why is the teacher walked over to that child at this point in the lesson? Or why didn't she start the lesson with an activity? Quite general ideas. Whereas the Quebecois teachers were talking about why she used that particular number in this equation to teach about this, because that's going to lead to children needing this knowledge that they don't yet have. It was much more about the pedagogy associated with mathematics in particular. So it was particularly, it was knowledge associated with the teaching of mathematics. And she was saying that knowledge is something that in Quebec, teachers have much more training on, the specific pedagogical content knowledge of mathematics, whereas in most other provinces in Canada, they will study teacher education and they will have a mathematics background, but they won't necessarily spend very long talking specifically about the pedagogy for mathematics. And she concluded by saying, I'm not saying that the other teachers aren't good or that they aren't doing a good job. I know teachers want to do their best and do the best for their students, but when teachers don't have the knowledge, you know, you can't. It can take a long time for you to learn that actually this is a better example to use when introducing children to quadratic equations, if you have to learn that through trial and error, rather than if you're taught that as part of your initial teacher education. A second example came from Finland, where one of the teachers I was staying with was talking to me about supporting struggling students. And this was her conclusion. She said, many times, I think it's about the methods. You know, you have to know the methods. You have to learn the methods. Of course, you can think of ideas yourself, but it's always easier if you've seen examples. So this is a context in which primary teachers will have a 5-year master's level degree in primary education. And a significant part of that is learning specific methods for supporting students with specific educational needs. So it's of course, there's a large part of it as well, which is about the application of that knowledge and practice in schools. But there's a specified knowledge. Look, you need to know about this method to support children with dyslexia. So I've talked already about two of these types of knowledge, and I know this is not a perfect conceptualization, but I find it quite a helpful way to talk about different kinds of knowledge that teachers might have or need. Of course, you have, starting from the right, you've got content knowledge. So if you want to be a maths teacher, you obviously have to know some mathematics, and that is important to a point. But I believe that beyond in an undergraduate degree level, it doesn't seem to make much difference to how good you are as a teacher if you have further knowledge of subject content. Pedagogical content, well, to the left, pedagogical knowledge is that more general knowledge of pedagogy, which is really important. So things like behavior management, principles of cognitive psychology, different approaches that you might take to get children interested, for example. But then what I was speaking about in that Quebec example is this overlap between the two, pedagogical content knowledge. And it's different to just having content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge. It's actually a whole different sphere of knowledge, which is about, well, how do I teach mathematics? How do I teach French? What are common misconceptions that children have when they're learning not just about biology, but about cell division? And how, therefore, can I best teach about cell division? What examples should I use, for example? And pedagogical content knowledge has been found to lead to higher student outcomes. So there is a strong correlation there between teachers having pedagogical content knowledge and student effects. And there was a study on that by Professor Rob Coe. Because we do increasingly have knowledge about what works. And I should have added there, not just what works, but what works in what context for who. Because obviously there's not one thing that's going to work everywhere for all different children. But we do increasingly have knowledge about research on what is effective in terms of different pedagogical approaches. And of course, it's not as much as in medicine. There's lots more funding that's gone into medical research. But I'm married to a doctor, and I can let you in on a secret that doctors don't know everything either. And just to give you a bit of a silly example, but I mentioned at the beginning, my leg swelled up in Singapore. And I came back home to England and had that investigated. And they described it as idiopathic edema. And I said to my husband, I've got idiopathic edema. And he's like, do you know what that means? I said, no. Idiopathic basically means we don't know why. So there's a name for, we don't know why her leg swelled up. But so that idiopathic edema means her leg swelled up and we don't know why. So doctors don't have all the knowledge either. But increasingly within education, we do have more and more research that we can draw on. And therefore knowledge that teachers can be equipped with to support them with their professional work. So I would like to introduce you to a model, because I have found it really helpful as a way of thinking about how does this important teacher knowledge move around a system? How is it created in the first place? And then how does it move around a system? Because this is a key difference that I observed between high-performing education systems and lower-performing education systems that I have subsequently studied, including my own. So it's adapted from Smith and Banalauer. This is not my framework, but I want to share it with you all. So if we start over on the left of the screen, I've just been talking about research. There is increasingly research in universities, mainly, on pedagogy, on what is effective, pedagogy and curriculum and assessment, what is effective for different students in different contexts. So that could be research on student thinking, effects of instructional strategies or materials, or assessment strategies, for example. And that shapes collective teacher knowledge. So I spoke at the beginning about part of what makes a profession, being there's this shared canon, this shared body of knowledge that anyone in that profession should have access to. Even if they don't know all of it, they should have access to it. And it's not as clearly defined in education, and I'm not even suggesting that necessarily it should be. There's not like one place that says this is all the stuff. But you do have a sense, within a country or within a school of a body of knowledge that actually, this is what we would want all of our teacher trainees to know before they go into a school, for example. Or this is the evolving body of knowledge that we want all the teachers in our particular school to have access to and to be using in their lessons. So this collective teacher knowledge can sit at different places. It can sit at a national level, it can sit at a school level, or within other organisations. And you can have that knowledge. That knowledge can exist somewhere, on a server, in a book, in a teaching framework, but obviously that doesn't mean it's actually known or used by teachers. It's through the act of teaching that where a teacher is actually using that knowledge in a practical context to teach that becomes their own personal teacher knowledge, is something that they know and can use in their classroom. Now, all of you, from what I've heard about who is on this call, will have lots of this knowledge yourselves, and it won't necessarily have come from research. Because we will all know a physics teacher or a history teacher that has been teaching in schools for 40 years and is an absolute wealth of knowledge. And they can tell you, actually, you're teaching about the Industrial Revolution. You want to be using these source materials. That would be a really great way to start off, or this is how you might lead an inquiry. So a lot of that knowledge that that teacher has can come from personal experience. Now, ideally, that personal experience from that long-standing history teacher or physics teacher should then be fed back into this collective teacher knowledge, so that knowledge from that individual moves around the system and is shared with more teachers. And so you should have this cycle. What actually happens in most countries, certainly I speak for my own, I believe this is the case in the US as well, is that there is a bit of a line down the middle. So where, yes, there's lots of research being done, and that might be helpfully kind of translated for teacher use by various organisations, pedagogical organisations, or even schools or textbook companies and teacher guides. And you might have lots of teachers, you will have everywhere, will have teachers who are very experienced and have lots of knowledge, but that knowledge stays in their head, they stay in their classroom, they shut their door, they retire, and that knowledge leaves with them. And then on the other side of the diagram, the research is generated. These, professors are coming up with some really key insights on how teachers can help students to learn better, and it sits behind a paywall or it sits on a website, and it doesn't actually get to the teachers that need to use it. So we need to think about how can we make sure this knowledge from both places is moving around the system. And one of the ways in which that moves around the system is teacher collaboration. And this helps both ways. Teacher collaboration can help get that research to becoming that personal teacher knowledge, and also that personal teacher knowledge can become collective teacher knowledge through teacher collaboration. And I'm going to share in a moment a number of different ways in which this is done in high-performing education systems. But first, I want to convince you all of the importance of teacher collaboration just through a couple of pieces of research that really have demonstrated the impact. It's not just a nice to have, it's not just a nice warm fuzzy thing because it's nice to talk, isn't it? It's nice to talk to people. It actually has an impact on student outcomes. So these are both studies from the US. So the first one is by Carrie Liana in New York. And she gave questionnaires to 1,000 teachers in New York. And she asked them questions about who they spoke to when they had a problem with their teaching and how much they trusted that person. And she measured student outcomes over the course of a year. And she found that when teachers were reporting frequent conversations with their peers that were about maths, when they trusted those people, students actually achieved higher gains over that year compared to teachers who didn't talk about maths with their colleagues, or they didn't have colleagues that they trusted to talk about maths with. And then Kraft and Pape found a similar thing. And this study focused on teacher improvement because beyond the first few years, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, beyond the first few years of teaching, teacher improvement can plateau. It's not necessarily the case that teachers will continue to improve the longer they spend in the classroom. It can be that improvement levels off. So Kraft and Pape were looking at teacher improvement over time. And they used questionnaires, and they got teachers to fill in questionnaires, and based on the answers to those questionnaires, gave schools a rating of how much of a supportive professional environment they were. And that included teachers having time to collaborate, and then mutual trust and respect. And just I'm going to give you some proper numbers here. So school teachers who are working in schools at the 75th percentile, so who are the higher end, the more supportive professional environments, they improved 38% more after 10 years than teachers in schools at the 25th percentile, so who are in less supportive professional environments. So just being in that professional environment, having time to collaborate with people that you trust, actually counts a lot for the levels of teacher improvement. Now, before I move on to talk about the specifics of what these countries do, I thought it might be helpful to centre this on the Czech Republic by giving you all an opportunity to discuss with each other what the system is within the Czech Republic, both nationally and in the level of individual schools, in terms of how teacher knowledge currently moves around the system. So 3 questions at the top here. So how is teacher knowledge created or captured in the first place in the Czech Republic? What are the kind of key institutions that do that, or key methods by which that happens? How does it currently move around the whole system? What's happening nationally to ensure that movement of knowledge around the system? And how does it move around individual schools? And I appreciate, this will be different depending on your school, but I know some of you are practitioners. So it would be interesting to hear what's going on in your school to ensure that knowledge from expert teachers and that knowledge from research is moving around the system. So we're going to get into breakout rooms for 10 minutes. So it's just coming up to 2:25. In England, it's coming up to 2:25. It's coming up to 3:25. So we will be back at 3:35 with having considered those 3 questions in your groups. So I wasn't going to do this, but now, especially because I can just see all your faces, I thought it might be nice just to have if anyone would like to share some reflection on what they were discussing with the group. Do feel free to do that in Czech, because this is more so that you can all share with your peers and your colleagues. So please don't worry about me. But if anyone would like to, just stick your hand up. You'd be very, very welcome. It will be nice to share some reflections from your group. And then we'll be going back into groups in another 15, 20 minutes or so. Katerina?
Hi, I will try in English, if it's okay.
Of course.
Sorry, I'm a little bit sick in bed. So we quite agree with each other about that in Czech Republic is the moving of the knowledge and stuff like that, mostly based on individual interests. Mm-hmm. So if the person is interested about educating and knowing more about stuff and how to teach better and stuff like that, they need to have their own interest, and they need to find it by themselves. But some other people from this group said that they have quite often meetings in the school when they talk about this stuff. Mm-hmm. But for example, in my school, we don't have stuff like that. So it's basically just if you want to know something, you can share it with someone, but it's not very often.
So it's reliant on that individual rather than it being an institutional.
Yeah, but like thing. I said, it's just in my school, but in the other school of the colleague who was there in our group, he said that they have meetings. So.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share anything? I can see that there's some comments in the chat. That's great. If any of those people would like to share what they were discussing, they would be very welcome.
Bohuši.
Well, we kind of agreed that most of the sharing happens out informally. That is exactly like the first group said. That is depends on the teachers. If they want to, they can. But as for the capturing the teacher's knowledge and creating, I think the dissertation studies, the students of the dissertation studies at like Pedagogical University in Brno, for example, they are willing, they want to create something that can be useful for the teachers. I think they even cooperate with the teachers, especially like Jiřina Karasová, for example, one of the members of the KVBU. She definitely does this. And I think also Czech National Inspections is trying lately to share such knowledge, that they are trying to be less controlling and more helping.
That's a really, really interesting point. And I do think, inspectorates can have a role to play in this. What happened in England. So I said, when I first started my research, knowledge wasn't discussed very much. Now it is actually talked about much more, and the inspectorate in England have played a role in that, because they've started to do exactly as it sounds like. The inspectorate are in Czech Republic. They started to support by doing research reviews, for example, for particular subjects. So there are now like research reviews that have the best research on the teaching of English or the teaching of biology or for all the subjects. Is Katerina, is that a hand from before, or is this a different Katerina?
Sorry, it was the same.
The same hand. Okay. Okay, lovely. We'll move on then, and then we'll have a further chance for discussion later. So I'm going to share a few specific structured ways in which teacher knowledge moves around the system in some of these high-performing systems. All of these things happen in at least a couple of places, but all of them don't happen everywhere. I think it would probably be too much if all of them happened in one country. So the first one is quite straightforward conceptually, but quite complicated logistically. And that is weekly timetabled planning within schools. So in Finland, Shanghai, Singapore, and Japan, in every teacher's timetable, there will be at least one period during the school week when they will be free at the same time as other teachers who teach the same year in primary or the same subject in secondary. And they will sit around the table and plan for the next week together. And so it's fairly straightforward in that, they will say, right, well, what are we teaching next week for year 3? Or what are we teaching year 7 and year 8 in maths? What resources do we already have? How did we do this before? What have we found to be helpful or not helpful in teaching this particular subject or this particular lesson? And so what you naturally have in that situation is more experienced teachers will be sharing, well, I do it like this. I find that this works well, or I find that whenever I'm teaching this subject, children often get confused about the difference between current and voltage, and therefore I now do this thing. And so you got that experience from those experienced teachers being shared every week in that planning session, so that newer teachers can learn from them. The learning also goes the other way, because of course, if you have younger teachers or newer teachers who have just recently come out of university and they've been studying pedagogy, they might have some knowledge of research, or of some new ideas of what might be effective that they can share with their colleagues who maybe haven't really been up to date with research for some time. And so that learning goes both ways. And if you think back to that cycle, is that from those two different sources of where that knowledge might come from the teacher experience and then also from the research. And there's a added advantage of that as well, is that they are sharing the workload as well, because there'll be some resources in the school already, but if they need to change something, if they think, oh, well, actually that didn't really work last year, or we want to try something new, then they might say, okay, well, if you can update the worksheets, I will go away and find a better introductory video for this thing. And so they're splitting those tasks rather than everyone sitting on their own sofa in their own sitting room, planning the same lesson as a teacher 2 roads away. So the second is a more in-depth, more complex version of that shared planning, which many of you will have come across before. It's one of these global ideas that has travelled, although sometimes it's a bit misunderstood. It's called lesson study. And lesson study originated in Japan, although it's very common in different forms across East Asian countries in particular. So when I was in Japan, and in every country that I visited, I did some teaching. Not very much. I was less helpful in non-English speaking countries. But I did a little bit. And when I did, I had 6 or 7 teachers sat at the back of the classroom watching me teach. And in the context that I come from, that's a scary thing. Because in an English context, if someone is sat at the back of a lesson watching you, the reason that they're there is they are judging your lesson. And they will be writing feedback. And then, not anymore, but when I first started teaching, they would give you a grade based on how good they thought your lesson was. So it was high stakes, it was stressful, and you were just trying to show that you were perfect and you had all the bells and all the whistles. In Japan, it's a very, very different context. It's a very different culture, but I think actually the reason it feels so different in Japan is because it's actually because of the policies and the structures rather than the culture. So in a Japanese context, it's very common to have lots of teachers sat at the back of the class watching someone else. But usually those teachers who are watching will have together planned that lesson that they are watching. So you have a group of teachers who will work together, usually teachers who teach the same subject or the same year group in primary. They will choose one lesson that might be because it's a lesson which they've had some trouble with, that students are finding this difficult, or it might be because they want to try something new, but they'll pick one lesson and they will plan this lesson in great detail. They will spend several meetings on it. They will go away, they will do some reading, they'll read some blogs, they'll read some research, they'll really think, right, what's the very best way we can start this lesson? How are we going to make sure that we are accommodating children with special needs? How are we going to make sure that we understand at each stage where the students are and what they've understood? How are we going to engage these students? All the questions that you might ask if you had lots of time to plan a lesson. They ask all of those questions and they discuss it together. They pool all of their expertise and they plan the best lesson that they can. One of those teachers will then teach that lesson to a real class and the others will watch. But what is different about this context compared to the context in England is that the teachers are not watching the teacher. They're not watching the teacher because they're not interested really in what the teacher is doing, because that's not why they're there. They're interested to see, is this lesson working well? Are the activities that we have jointly designed having the desired effect on the students? So they're watching the students, they're listening to the students, they're seeing how are the students responding, what have they understood. They will do some kind of small assessment, usually talk to some students afterwards and see how they found it. And then they will meet again and they will feedback. And again, together, they will make that lesson even better. And then someone else will teach this updated lesson. And on it goes. And what that means is that they are basically studying the object of our profession. They are studying this interaction between the teaching and the learning. How does this teaching input lead to learning in these students, and how can we make that better? So in doing that, they are generating new knowledge. They're generating new knowledge about what is effective in this subject or in this year group, in this context. And so they're learning that themselves. And obviously there's a lot of sharing of knowledge within that process. But what they'll often do, so they do this not only in Japan, they do this in Shanghai and in Singapore, and they will often then write up the results of that study in a teacher journal, which is less like an academic journal, more like a professional magazine. And one or several of those teachers will write and say, we tried this thing, these are the results, and we learned X, Y, and Z. So then other teachers from other schools can read about what they did when they're doing their own lesson study. So that is the second structure that helps this knowledge move around the system. So there's also an option to use paper. It doesn't always have to be conversations, live conversations. There are some limitations to live conversations in terms of just teacher time. So another way that this knowledge can move around the system is through the construction or co-construction of teacher guides. So when I was in Singapore, I was watching a lesson on friction, and the students were all doing an experiment, where they're rubbing different materials against each other and they're seeing, is this difficult or is it easy, and making notes. And while the children were doing this, I walked over to the teacher's desk, and I noticed that on her desk, she had a book open on her desk, double page, and it had everything that you could possibly want to know about how to teach friction in these 2 pages. So it had activity ideas, common misconceptions that children have when they're learning about friction, useful analogies or demonstrations, hinge questions, by which I mean questions you can ask to find out what the students have understood and whether you can move on or not, extension questions and activities for students who have already got it and need a bit of an extra stretch. So all of this was there for her to use on her desk. Now, this has a number of benefits, obviously, that you don't need to do as much planning, because even if you were to turn up to that lesson, having not done any planning, and then you had that open on your desk, that would give you a lot of ideas for, if you were an experienced teacher, a lot of ideas on how to run this lesson. But of course, it also means that teachers are actually learning as they are teaching, because they are, through the use of this material, they are actually then have more knowledge about how best to teach about friction. And in this school, this teacher guide was actually constructed by teachers within that school. And there are different models of this. You can do it at the school level, you could do it at a district level, and you could do it at a system level, and that's obviously what publishers do, where they get expert teachers involved. But in this school, they had a series of meetings, over probably, it must have taken them about a year or more. But they had gone through the whole syllabus, and all of the teachers had pooled all of their expertise onto this one double spread for each lesson. So it's, in a way, it's kind of like the kind of conversations they're having during that weekly timetable planning, the option A, but captured over a series of weeks and months and put into a teacher guide for teachers to use from then onwards. So that's another idea for how knowledge can move around the system. I'm going to share one more, and then I'm going to give you all a further opportunity to discuss with each other around what already exists in relation to these things in the Czech Republic, what might be useful, what barriers you might face, what might need adapting. So the last thing is kind of an expansion of the lesson study idea. Excuse me. Lots of these systems that I visited had professional learning communities, which it sounds like one of you mentioned just now that one of the schools did have these groups. But it's not just any old community. It's not enough to just have a group of teachers meeting to talk about pedagogy. I'm sure that is helpful, as the evidence suggested before. Just talking about pedagogy is helpful. But in these high-performing systems, all of these professional learning communities followed a roughly similar structure to how they conducted those conversations and what they were actually doing. So I can share these slides afterwards if anyone wants to see these details of these 3 different countries. But these are also, you can find them in the paper I've put at the bottom, which is worth a read. The one by Jensen and colleagues in 2016. So they went and did some research on professional learning communities in various different systems. So what they have in common, although there are some variations, is they start with some kind of student learning analysis. So they are having a look in British Columbia, they are scanning for evidence of student learning or lack of student learning. Or in Shanghai, there's a set research question based on student learning. So some kind of identification of this is the particular learning or learning problem that we are interested in addressing. That's usually focused on subject-specific expertise. It's not just general pedagogy. Usually this is about particular student learning within a particular subject. They will then review the evidence, have a look at what evidence suggests might help here, and come up with some kind of idea, a hunch, a particular teaching strategy that they think might help to address this problem or improve student learning in the area that they've identified. They'll then try that out. They will take action. They will test those strategies. The members of the community all go away and try out this new thing, try out this idea of we think this thing might help. They will review whether or not it actually is helping. So there will be some kind of checking, some kind of analysing of evidence. How will we know if this is working? What will be different about the students or different about their learning? They will then come back together and feedback, right? What worked, what didn't work? And it's a cycle. So often they might come back and say, well, actually, no, that didn't work. In which case they will run that cycle again. They will develop a new hunch based on, they will look at some different research evidence. They will try something else and they will come back and try something new until they manage to improve the thing that they're trying to improve. So they're sustained over time. This is not just a one-off. It's something that they will do on a regular basis. Approximately, and this number 5 here is from Dylan William, approximately every 4 weeks. This is what Dylan William says, every 4 weeks for at least 75 minutes with 8 to 12 participants. Although I know in East Asia there are fewer people than that, so I think it does work with fewer. And they're obviously collaborative. But yeah, do you have a read through the different versions there? But you can see that they are different. But they're all similar in terms of identifying a particular problem, coming up with a new idea based on research, trying it out, seeing if it works, feeding back again. So I'm going to stop talking again and share these are the things I've just, these are the things that I've just talked through. So which of the following already happen in the Czech Republic, which might be useful to include either at your school or at a system level? What could be encouraged, or what could you help to structure? And I know that you're all from very different backgrounds, and so I don't know what organisations you're from, but whether your organisation could support the implementation of any of these ideas, and what might the barriers be to the implementation of these things. And then a more optimistic question, what could be done to overcome those barriers? So there's quite a lot there, I appreciate. So I think we'll have slightly longer this time. So we're just coming up to 4 o'clock in your time. Although I do want to leave time for questions. And let's have 13 minutes. So it's 3 minutes to 4. So if we come back at 10 past, and then we will carry on. I think everyone's back.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some good discussions. I hope that something in there that might be potentially of use to you in your contexts. Rather than taking feedback or sharing your ideas this time, I'm just going to share a few final thoughts, and then I want to leave time for us to have a Q&A, but also potentially discussion in a moment. So I said at the beginning that there were two main ways in which I thought that the teaching professions in these high-performing systems were quite similar to the medical profession. And the second one was around how people relate to their colleagues and collaboration. But a second part of that is that there is some hierarchy, which isn't a concept that people are always comfortable with in all cultural contexts. But nevertheless, I think can be quite helpful, where that hierarchy is not just about one person's in charge of another person, but rather recognition of professional competence, and where one person is therefore able to be an expert guide for another. And Singapore, as with many things, is kind of the global case study in this respect. So Singapore have a teacher career ladder, which is based on 3 different routes that teachers can take. So everyone starts off as a classroom teacher. Like most countries, there's an option of a leadership track where you become a head of department, a principal, and then ultimately, and this is more unusual, the Director General of Education is top of that track, rather than it being a political appointment. But unlike other countries, they also have 2 other tracks, one where they become specialists in a range of different things, or curriculum or special needs, for example. But the other is a teaching track. And this is the one I want to focus on. So within Singapore, if you want to get a promotion and if you want to get paid more after your first few years of teaching, you need to be promoted to being a senior teacher. And what that means is that you need to meet certain competencies. You need to know certain things. You need to be able to do certain things. There is set professional development that comes with that. So you complete certain courses that give you the knowledge and the skills that you need. And then you are then assessed against these competencies to see whether or not you've met them and can get that promotion. This has 2 benefits. One is that it provides a motivation for all teachers to want to improve. And I know we would all like to believe that all teachers naturally do want to improve, but we all know that that's not ever true for everyone in any country. And so, we were speaking before, weren't we, about how in Czech Republic, it's up to the individual teacher to find out about research if they're interested in it. Well, this model that Singapore has means that everyone needs to be interested in it, and needs to ensure that they continue to learn and that they continue to improve, because their promotion depends on it. The second benefit is, of course, that you then have more senior teachers who are able to act as expert mentors to more junior teachers, and that this mentorship is actually based on them having certified competencies, rather than what can happen in some countries where mentors can be someone who's been there for the longest, which often does mean that they are competent, but does not always mean that they are competent. And you can have sometimes people being mentors who themselves are not very good. So this ensures that the people who are taking on that mentorship role are themselves good teachers. Now, in this model, to introduce a model like this for most countries would require civil service reform. So it's not very easy to do. So I'm just going to share another model with you that's a slightly kind of less intensive model that doesn't require civil service reform. And that's a program that I evaluated a few years ago in New York City called Teacher Career Pathways. And in this program, the teacher career structure and pay structures remained the same, but there were these additional roles that were added on as well. So there were 3 new roles created: model teacher, peer collaborative teacher, and master teacher. And those roles, teachers had to apply for them, of course, and then be accepted into this new position. And if they got this position, it came with a bit more money, a bit more time in their timetable to take on these additional responsibilities, and some additional responsibilities. And there were 3 different levels of this. So model teacher was quite simply a teacher being the one who is interested and goes and looks at the research and tries out new things in their classroom, and being happy to open their door and invite their colleagues to come and see what they were doing. So I think it's beautifully simple as a structural reform. And it actually is quite remarkable in its impact for such a simple thing, because just by those teachers saying, hey guys, on Wednesday next week, I'm going to be trying out this new technique or this new idea. Please feel free to come and watch me and let me know what you think. What that creates over time is a change of culture, in which some, not everyone's going to be interested to start with, but some teachers will go and watch their colleague and say, hey, oh, that's really interesting. I'm going to try that in my classroom. And then they might say, oh, would you mind coming and watching me and let me know if I'm doing this right? And maybe you can give me some feedback. And over time, that can change a culture in a school from being one where everyone has their door shut to one where everyone is supporting each other to improve. 2 further roles: peer collaborative teachers are responsible for organising those professional learning communities that I spoke of and leading those. And master teachers work across schools, supporting professional learning across a whole district. But it's a model that did create change in New York City. And just a couple of quotes here from teacher leaders that I spoke to in New York. So, for example, the school has got into a culture of collaboration. With the shift in culture, the onus was on teachers to work together with student achievement at the core. A lovely shift, with teachers' voice more important than anything. So it just really speaks to that, that in the intangible culture shift. Something it's difficult to measure a culture, but that shift was simply caused by paying some teachers a bit more, giving them a bit of time, and giving them permission in a way to say, you know what, please do invite your colleagues in. No one's going to think that you're showing off, because this is now part of your job. Share what you're doing. Invite your colleagues into your classroom. So that's just a final idea that I wanted to share with you, for you all to consider in your contexts, to have a think if that or something like it might be helpful. But rather than us going off into individual groups now, we've got 11 minutes. So I think it would be good now to move into Q&A. So in case anyone's got any questions, and I will say right now, I don't have all the answers. I see my role as very much kind of sharing good ideas from elsewhere, rather than being an expert in these things myself. But I will do my best to answer any questions that you might have. I'm going to stop sharing, and then please put your hand up if you have a question.
I'm just going to say, if you don't feel like asking in English, feel free to write your question in Czech, and we will provide a translation for Lucy to respond to it.
Alexis has gone old school and is putting his real hand up, which I love.
Thanks for appreciating that. Lucy, thanks very much for the talk. And you started off today by saying, as a trainee teacher in England, we talked more about skills, teacher skills, than teacher knowledge. And you've traveled around the world and you've seen all those effective systems. And my question was, I trained in England as a teacher, maybe some 12, 13 years ago. And the emphasis was by Ofsted, by the university, by the inspection, by my mentors, was on pupils discovering knowledge by themselves. And now, from what I've been able to gather, it seems to be the other way around. People say pupils need more knowledge. Pupils in England lack knowledge. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to ask, what do you think about this development? And is knowledge versus skills a false dichotomy? Is there a way of somehow, putting those two together? And perhaps, this could go. My question is really about pupils, but I'd be interested in your perspective on teacher education too.
Mm-hmm. Wow, going straight in there with the really big questions, Alexis. Thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right in terms of your observations or what you've picked up on what's changed since you were teaching in England. Very much has moved from one in which Ofsted are encouraging lots of student-led learning, student discovery learning, to one in which that is not quite frowned upon, but certainly much more focused on, right, what do students know? How do you know that they know it? And quite a big role for cognitive science in that as well, or cognitive science as a justification for that, and therefore seeing practices like retrieval practice, where children as part of lessons are asked to recall things that they'd learned previously. So yeah, that definitely has happened. My reflections on that are that it's largely a good thing, but that it's gone too far, in my opinion. I think knowledge and skills are two sides of the same coin, and it doesn't make sense to separate them. And we're talking about two separate things, but closely related, aren't we? We're talking about knowledge and skills in terms of as a curricular object, but we're also talking about the pedagogies that are appropriate to teach those things. And I think, in order for children to, there's so many layers to this, aren't there? So knowledge and skills, I think, are two sides of the same coin. Even when you're teaching a skill, like most skills that you're teaching map reading, there's some knowledge that underpins that. But then for children to have the skill of map reading, it's not enough that they know what longitude and latitude are. They also have to practice using it in order to have that skill. So most skills that are real things, hear me out. Most skills that are real things are underpinned by some knowledge, and it's helpful for a curriculum to identify what that knowledge is. It's helpful for teachers to know what that knowledge is so that they can explicitly teach it, and then give the student the opportunity to use it and apply it until they are fluent in whatever that skill might be. I think where systems sometimes go wrong, and this is encouraged by the OECD, unhelpfully so, is to think about skills as being these more nebulous things like critical thinking and creativity, and trying to teach those. And often when you have things like inquiry-based learning, it is in the name of teaching so-called 21st century skills. And while I think there is a place for that, it's often done badly because it is seen as being instead of teaching them knowledge, and with the thought that, well, children don't really need knowledge, or they do need knowledge, but it doesn't really matter what that knowledge is so long as they've got the skills, because they can look up the knowledge on the computer. And that doesn't really take into account cognitive psychology and how children learn, nor does it acknowledge that things like critical thinking are not actually transferable skills. They are domain specific. So you can only think critically about something if you know about it. And it's very, very limited what you can teach a child about critical thinking unless it is anchored within a particular subject. Because what it means to think critically in science is a very different thing to what it means to think critically about history. And you need different knowledge and you need different skills to do that in two different subjects. So I think, yeah, long answer. I think broadly speaking, we've gone in a good direction, but there is a risk that in focusing so much on knowledge and teaching children the knowledge, that children aren't always then given the opportunity to apply that knowledge in their own way and explore in diverse and different and creative ways, and that is valuable as well. But I think it's a matter of chronology. You need to have a secure understanding of a topic before you are really able to then apply that learning in a creative way.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Any other questions? I can see that there's 3 comments in the chat. I don't know if any of those.
Yeah, there's a
Okay, comments other than questions.
Oh, she.
I wanted to ask if you could choose any of the systems that you have visited, which one would you most likely teach in and why?
Most like to teach in. So I get different versions of this question and it's got different answers. So which I might most like to teach in would probably be Finland. For entirely selfish reasons. Because Finnish teachers of all the systems I went to work the least. In most places, the workload is too high. I think that's a global problem. I think teachers work very, very hard. So I think that the amount that teachers in Finland work is more appropriate.
Jsem jedinej, kdo...
Ne, je tady nějaký jako zamrznuto.
Ano, zamrznutí všem asi.
Lucy, we don't know if you can hear us, but we are having hard connect. Takže uvidíme, určitě se Lucy k nám zpátky přidá.
A máme vlastně velké štěstí, že se to stalo až v posledních v podstatě 3 minutách, takže...
Here she is. Okay.
I'm sorry, my internet automatically switched to a different Wi-Fi. Apologies.
Okay. So the question, you remember the question?
Yes, I do. I don't know how much of it you heard and how much of it you didn't. But Finland, because teachers' workload is manageable, because teachers are supported, they don't have an inspectorate or a high-stakes accountability system. So they're largely trusted and left to get on with it. And they have really good teacher training, extensive teacher training, and they are supported to be good teachers before they start having full responsibility being a teacher.
Okay. You have another one you'd call?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the talk. I have I think it's a short and actually quite practical question. If maybe you, but anyone else could or has a tip for a good read about the lesson study, something practical, the lesson study approach, how to set it up well, maybe also like how to set the observations then up well, like a practical guide.
Not off the top of my head, but I can have a look on my laptop at what I've got. And I can send it on to Gabriella if I find something.
Because you also mentioned that it's, it can be done in different ways. And what you described, the way that it's actually done in Japan, I think that works. And so it would be good to have like a good example to follow.
I want to say, I think Takahashi is the name of the author. So there's an author, I think basically if you find descriptions of lesson study in English, but that are by Japanese authors, that's your best bet, because then it will actually be the Japanese lesson study rather than the one that went to America and then got changed in America. I think it's Takahashi, but I could be mistaken. But if I can find anything that is a good guide, I will send it on to Gabriella or Petra to share with you.
Somebody's sharing the book.
Oh, that was quick. Great. Oh, it actually is Takahashi. There we go. That's good. Brilliant. Thanks very much for having me, everyone.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, since we were going to leave, we talk about the impact of this meeting on everybody's practice, right? Earlier. So
Yeah.
if there is one thing that you wouldn't want people to forget as they leave this meeting, can you think of one that you shouldn't forget, because other things will roll into our lives? And
I suppose for me, it's that it's an image rather than an idea, and it's that model, that that circle, that there needs to be a cycle between research and teachers' experience, and the movement needs to go both ways. So thinking about, in your practice, whether that's in teacher education or in a school or school leadership, how are you making sure that there is that movement? And there's lots of different ways, as discussed, that can happen, but how is it happening in your context, and just making sure that it is happening.
Great. Thank you. Also, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
For sharing your experiences and knowledge about the topics. It was very appreciated. We had over 50 people present, and so it's been a valuable hour and a half of having you here and listening to the ideas. So we're gonna move on and see how all of this can be taken into teacher preparation in groups. So lovely to have you here, and hopefully next time it will be in person so you can enjoy.
I hope so. That would be nice.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Well,
thank you so much for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you.